I now have two secondary windows, one called course window, which we designed in the previous video. The second one I added outside of the videos, which is called student window, but it's very much the same as the course one. It also allows you to edit a single student. This student is passed as a parameter to the class constructor. We'll then save it at the class level as a property, so we can then use it when we have a student filled with some data. So inside the main window, we're calling the secondary window. The only difference compared to what we designed in the previous video is how we have this helper method called try_get_select_student. And you might notice something very similar to how methods like in try_parse or in try_parse or datetime try_parse behave. The main return value is a Boolean flag. It's either true or false, whereas the main output value comes as a null parameter. In our case, it's a student. And this method is used to remove this unnecessary duplication of this message box, which, if you notice the logic of the edit course and remove course, it has this warning that an item from this box should be selected. And in fact, this warning is very similar in both of these methods. It's basically the same. So to remove this unnecessary repetition, I've extracted this to a helper method called try_get_select_student. So you can take a look at how this method is then used in both of our edit and remove methods. All the rest stays more or less the same as for courses. So now I will extend my student window. At the moment it has two rows. In fact, this row is already added some kind of with perspective of having a data grid in between the this top text box and the buttons at the bottom. So what I will do now is I will move my stack panel, which is currently the second row with index 1. I'll move it to row number 2 with index 2, and in between I will add a data grid. A data grid allows you to build a tabular design with columns and rows. So columns are usually defined in the data grid definition, whereas rows come from the data source. So I will add a name to this data grid. I know I'm pretty sure that I'll be using this name in my code behind file. So I will name it DataGrid grades. So I will put it in grid row number 1, and it will span 2 columns. So I'll set column span to 2. I will straight away increase the height of the window slightly, so for this data grid to become visible. Now I will I will manually define 2 columns of this data grid. It's done in the following fashion. So we define an inner datagrid.columns tag, and in turn inside this columns tag, a pair of tags, we define 2 text columns. I can do them in a single tag, both opening and closing. So normally we define a header for each column. So the first will be course, that is just the display value in the top row of the table. The second one will be called grade. And now, similar to how we define list box display member path, we have to define which properties values have to be taken out of. So I know that basically this data grid will store a list of grades, and if you remember how our student class is designed, that is in fact this very list, which is in a single student. So this will become the item source for my list box, for my data grid. So each item is a single grade. Each grade has 2 properties, one called course, the other called value. So this is where my data will come from. So coming back to the student window, I will set this connection using special binding syntax. So the first property, the first data grid column will be bound to course name. So I'm using the dot operator here to dive into the course, which is a complex object, as you hopefully understand. The second value will be taken simply from the value property. Value is a simple property. It's an integer value, so this can just be taken from where it is. Alright, so one last thing to adjust in my student window constructor, where I'm analyzing the incoming data and either using its properties or constructing a new object. I will set the data source for my data grid grades. So item source will come from student grades. For the future, just to make sure that this list actually exists, even though it's not required for this to be not non-null, just for the future, I will slightly adjust my student class. To be precise, I will insert an empty constructor, a parameterless constructor, which will just create these grades as a new list. Right. Again, it's not strictly required, but again, for the perspective, it's good to have a non-null list. Okay, so let's try to run the application and see how it behaves. Now, I haven't inserted everything that I actually need, and in fact, you'll straight away see some interesting behavior with a couple of columns appearing automatically. This is due to the fact that by default, DataGrid analyzes your source object and it generates the columns just based on the properties this object has. In fact, we don't need this as we define the columns ourselves, so we have to turn off column generation, and this is done using a special property of the DataGrid called auto-generate properties, which is a Boolean flag, and we'll set this property to false. So now we're left with just our own properties. They don't look really nice because they're kind of shrinked to the minimal needed size. So what I will do is I will extend the first column by setting the so-called relative width. This star tells me that this will actually occupy as maximal as much space as it needs. So if several columns have this relative width definition, then they will split the available space accordingly. So if one has a width of 1 star, the second has a width of 2 star, then the first column will take 1/3 of the available space, the second column will take 2/3. So now this looks more appropriate. Of the data grid, I'll also give it a small margin, otherwise it's really very close to the borders of my window. So that's it. Now, also by default, you see this extra line, which is actually used for editing. So my design will actually prevent doing this. I will also set the isRead-only property to true. And in fact, I advise you to do this at the beginning, otherwise you may easily run into certain types of errors, which will be very hard to find without really diving deep into WPF and how data binding works. So just to keep things simple, the data grids for us will just be used in the read-only mode. Okay, so this is more or less what we wanted. Now we advance to the next step. So let's add the logic for displaying students' rating. So I will do it in a separate row of my virtual grid. So now I will actually insert a text block right after DataGrid. So my stack panel now goes to row number 3. And row number 2 will hold a simple text block. So it will be in row number 2 and also covering 2 columns. So that column span to 2. Again, I will set this from my code, so I'll assign a name to it. So, and I think that is what we actually need. Again, we can put a margin just for it to have a consistent layout. Right, so let's now set this text block from my code. And now we come into this problem of where the code that calculates the student's rating based on its grades, on his or her grades, should be placed. So just insert the simplest possible solution first. So my text block rating will come from by calculating the rating using a special help method which I'll call calculate rating of a given student. Again, I'm pressing Control dot here, and you see it suggests me to add a method called calculate rating. Now just one thing, because automatically cannot figure out the return type, because here actually in this string formatting any value can be used, so it gives me an absolute basic object type. I know that rating will be an integer value, so I will just insert the simplest possible calculation here. So I'll go over all grades of my given student, and I'll simply add them to the overall rating and return this as a value. Okay, so this is how it looks like. I select a student, and this text block shows me the current rating of the student based on the grades by simply adding them together. So the second student has a different grade, obviously just 6. So now we'll fix this functionality for the moment, and in the next video we will do some refactoring and introduce abstractions to our application.